New developments keep rising, but schools are far away. There's no transportation network that connects buses, subway, bikes, and walkable areas, and community services are incomplete or poor in quality. Each municipality makes its own choices. Without regional coordination, rules overlap and often contradict what already exists in each area. Urban centers have grown apart, like islands that never connect, and many homes end up abandoned. I'm Adriana, an urban planner. It's 2040, and Monterrey paints a troubling picture. Water and energy are being wasted. Safety is increasingly limited. Gentrification keeps pushing the most vulnerable out of the city. And communities live under the shadow of decisions built on assumptions that never worked. Divided opinions and the absence of real agreements mean every effort to improve the city ends up colliding with another. Those failed initial assumptions multiply, and problems grow bigger and more complex, where each decision can make the next one worse. The city feels trapped in a loop, where every action brings unintended consequences, and the challenges keep building up, unresolved.
It may sound like fiction, but this future isn't as far away as it seems. Without institutional coordination and planning guided by data, projects in Monterrey will remain stuck, leaving the city trapped in actions that go nowhere.
Welcome everyone to the Policy Lab, a podcast from the School of Government and Public Transformation at Tecnológico de Monterrey, where big public challenges meet evidence-based solution. I'm Miguel Ángel Santos, Dean of the school and your host, and today we'll explore how government and communities can plan for the future when uncertainty is the only certainty. When problems are weak, futures unknowable, probabilities unknowable, and the stakes are profoundly human. To help us navigate this terrain, no one better than Stephen Popper, distinguished university professor at decision science at Tecnológico de Monterrey, or Faculty of Excellence, as we call it, and senior emeritus economist at the RAND Corporation. Stephen has spent his career helping governments and institutions make better decisions under deep uncertainty, and decisions that range from technological transitions, transportation, housing, and economic strategy. So welcome, Stephen. It is a pleasure to have you with us today.
It's an honor. Thank you.
Welcome. And before I jump into the questions, I was thinking that I cannot let you go with saying RAND Corporation and not explaining to people how RAND came up and what it means and your years working there.
Oh.
Because I will give context to the work we're going to explore later on.
Sure. So RAND is a private, not-for-profit research institute. It has existed in its earliest form going back to just after the Second World War. And it is, its principal mission is to provide analysis on issues of public policy ranging from education, defense, welfare, health, and so on and so forth, but also to raise the public understanding of public policy issues.
Yeah, over the Cold War, this was the place where many of the interactions were modeled and decisions were, I wouldn't say taken, but informed by developing game theory and all of those things.
Operations research.
It's quite a place. And most of Stephen's work was developed at RAND. We have the fortune of having him with us at the School of Government from 2 years ago. You joined us on a full-time basis on our school in Ciudad de Mexico. And today I wanted to talk to Stephen about his VSCARP methodology. As it turns out, VSCARP, it's a short for visions, strategic concept, assumptions, and robust pathways. Can you tell us how this approach emerged? Is there a result of what sort of interactions
Yeah.
I like to talk with people about how the idea developed,
Sure.
that this was needed. What problem is this solving?
Well, you asked the right question. I mean, we could sit here and talk about methodologies because we're both, at least now, we're both university professors and so on. But the real question is, so what? What's the value added? And that really is how this methodology came about. I've become interested in what are called wicked problems in public policy. It's a term that for Spanish-speaking listeners does not really translate very well into Spanish.
Yeah, we do problemas complejos, but it's more. It's beyond that.
Yeah, I think you have to at least use the word madre in there somewhere to really get the flavor of a wicked problem. But wicked problems, it's interesting. The term came about in a paper in 1973. And this was at a time that their approach to public policy was, let's make this a science. We'd put a man in the moon, 4 years previous to this paper emerging. We had figured out what to do with poverty in places like St. Louis and Chicago and Philadelphia by putting up these massive, buildings that were going to reduce poverty, that were going to reduce crime, and so on. So it was kind of strange. They came out with this paper saying, there are things called wicked problems where this approach is not going to work. And people kind of said, yeah, okay, whatever. And then the 90s come around, and we discover that the scientific approach to management and organization has limitations. We're in fact bulldozing and taking down those buildings that turned out to have exactly the opposite effect of what had been intended on things like poverty, on things like crime. And people were beginning to realize that there was a class of problems that really were very hard to address, were even difficult to put a name to. What exactly is the problem? What could be the solution, and so on. And it very much characterizes a lot of the policy issues that we face today in education and transportation and you name it. So that was one thread. The second, I'll just mention briefly, as you know, I spent a lot of time developing techniques, using models and data, some pretty high-powered computer science and so on, to get a different view of problems that were characterized not just by uncertainty, but deep uncertainty. And I had always been interested in the last part, not all the stuff that you publish in the academic journals, but how do you then convey that to the public, to decision makers? So I've been always interested in how do you speak to people? How do you use these concepts and put them in a framework that they can understand? And then the third thread is, in the 2010s, I spent a lot of time doing project work outside the United States. And I became convinced that there was a systemic problem with democracy, with the institutions of democratic governance, and that these institutions were being asked to function in an environment that the designers of those institutions had absolutely no conception of. And so how do we make democratic governance work? And that's kind of the third thread that kind of led me to the VSCARP work.
I like that it's problem-driven because far too many times you find people with great solutions looking for a problem to solve.
Yeah.
And here you actually started the problem. I was thinking as I was going through your VSCARP draft of paper, I'm fortunate enough to have an anticipation of it, what is different from what I do? I mean, we here at the school, we plan for the future. There's a place we want to be in the future, and there's a place where we are today. To get there, we need certain actions. To perform those actions, we need certain resources. That's the way I've thought about it. So specifically, what I found different about this was ABP, assumptions-based planning. I never really thought about when we say we need to take these actions to get there, what are the implicit assumptions I'm making? So that's something I want to comment that I found differential. The second thing that I found differential is that the future is not going to be that future where we want to get, but just a range of scenarios. And then all the actions I'm taking have different robustness across those scenarios.
Right.
And it never occurred to me that instead of thinking where I want to get, period, I mean, there are actions that can take me to where I'm going to get in a very high proportion of the scenarios that we're able to think of. Did I get that right? Did I miss something?
Yeah, I mean, that is correct. So you asked about VSCARP. So assumption-based planning is one of the kind of 4 foresight techniques that we use in that. And assumption-based planning, it actually came about going back to the Rand Corporation. There was a group doing work for the U.S. Army, looking at the so-called Army 21 plan, like what would be the main governing plan for the U.S. Army for training and for, procurement and so on for the 21st century. And so they developed this technique, assumption-based planning, which was to take a plan and look at what they called load-bearing assumptions were. Sometimes these were explicit. More often than not, they were buried in the plan, and they developed various techniques. And one of the things they came up with in doing this, about 1988 or so, was they said to the Army, you really have this implicit assumption that your main fight was going to be on the Central Front in Germany, between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. What happens if that assumption is invalidated? What does that do to the rest of your plan? So that gives you kind of a flavor of assumption-based planning. I can talk a little bit more about it, but it talks in terms of load-bearing assumptions, how those assumptions might be broken. How can you look for signals that might suggest that one of your assumptions might be broken? What are hedging strategies, insurance policies that you could do along with your strategy? What are shaping actions that you could take? How could you affect the environment, so that it's more conducive to your plan? I mean, the classic shaping strategy is an advertising campaign. So when the consumer goes into the store, and he or she sees the product for the first time, it's not the first time they've seen it. You've shaped the environment and so on. So we took assumption-based planning and we said, what if instead of doing it at the end of a planning process, you did it at the beginning of a planning process and use it as a way of mapping out what might be the possible strategies of courses of action. Just put them on a spectrum, everywhere from do nothing to laissez-faire to the government does takes over the program. All these these different intermediaries, and that really was kind of the germ that led to the VSCARP method.
Now that you are mentioning that, it made me think of something that caught my attention in the paper, which is that, you referred to democracy earlier on. These are problems that involve a community. People in the community have different principles, different conceptions of the goal they want to get, etc. So I wanted you to talk a bit about what have you found more difficult in that process of bringing people together. And one specific question I had is, when the discussion is about assumptions, is it less polarized? Is it easier to work through differing views within the group when discussions are about what are you assuming when you say this action will take us there, or what are we assuming? It sounds to me it can be less polarizing, but I don't know if that happens.
Yeah, so a couple of things to be said about that. What we are doing is not holding consensus building sessions. That's not the goal. We're not holding planning sessions. What we're dealing with are all of the things that cause consensus building and planning to kind of blow up. And one of those things is, well, okay, we need to figure out what we're going to do. We need to have some idea about what the future is going to be. Let's come to a set of assumptions, about the future. And people are not stupid. They understand very well that the assumptions that you make at the beginning are going to determine where you get to at the end. And therefore, you will spend all of your time talking only about assumptions, as opposed to exposing assumptions not in some sort of a contested space, but I described a little bit earlier, coming up with a series of possible courses of action. Mm-hmm. What you do as a group is you talk about, okay, what are the assumptions in each one? Which of these are load-bearing assumptions? How could they be broken? Et cetera, et cetera. It becomes kind of a group activity. So people who come with the deliberate intent to blow things up and to advocate for a particular course of action find it very difficult to do. A second thing that I would say is crucially, when you talk about, strategy, what are we going to do, and so on, everybody loves to talk about that. They want to talk about, strategy. Yeah, you came from Tec de Monterrey. You came from the Rand Corporation. What are your views on strategy? I said, no. No, we can't have that conversation yet. It's not meaningful. First, you need to tell me what the vision is. What does good look like? Yeah. And so we spend most of the first day of these 2-day workshops actually developing a statement of vision.
A shared vision.
Not so much a shared vision, but what elements do we all recognize should be part of a shared vision? And only then can you have a useful conversation about strategy and assumptions and so on. So it automatically deconflicts. Some of the human dynamics also act as a deconfliction mechanism. And, our goal is really to develop a language. Anytime you do a project of this sort, there's a product outcome, there's the report, there's the plan, there's the white paper and so on, but there's also a process outcome about the way that people are able to articulate concerns and so on. And in many ways, that is perhaps one of the principal outputs from something like this. All of a sudden, people have a language they can use to talk about goals and courses of action in a dynamic framework.
Yep.
That just changes everything.
Yeah. You just run an exercise like this at the Tecnológico de Monterrey, focused on adequate and affordable housing in Monterrey, where you brought together a group of people. You got there, housing developers, government officials. How did that work out? What were the main big ideas you got out of there? And anything you want to share about that experience that can help people listening to us to figure out what sort of hurdles they will find when they run a VSCARP workshop?
So the situation with housing affordability and housing quality in Monterrey is probably the best classic wicked problem I've ever run across. I mean, it's just amazing. You're talking about a municipality or a region with 16 different municipalities. There is no, kind of higher level regional body that is coordinating. So all of the municipalities are setting rules that not only conflict with each other, but conflict with other things going on in that municipality. The biggest value that we had is so often the case when you come and say, oh, I've got this novel technique, let's try it, was despair. They had tried everything else, and they had such a feeling of failure. And, people traveling for several hours a day in each direction just to get basic services, to get to jobs. There's a huge problem with housing abandonment in Nuevo León and particularly in Monterrey and so on. So I had actually spent some time the summer before meeting with groups of builders, with people from Infonavit, the principal financer of housing in Mexico, with people in planning offices in some of the different communities within metropolitan Monterrey. And I listened to their problems, I asked them questions, and then I said, well, what would happen if completely informally and unofficially tech was to put together a venue, a workshop where all these different groups could come together. And they were wildly enthusiastic. And I'm not certain I'm answering all aspects of your question.
Oh, one aspect was this gathering facilitated with the methodology you just described. What came out of it that you can say, this would have never happened in the absence of, what was the big idea?
Yeah, a couple of things came out. So the methodology, first you talk about visions in small groups, big groups, so on and so forth. You kind of derive what would be the elements of a vision, and then you put people again back in small groups, and you say, okay, what are possible pathways from where we are now to where you guys say that you want to be? And this is where the strategic concepts comes in the VSCARP methodology. So by strategic concepts, we mean really simple ideas that you could put on a bumper sticker. Well, how are we going to get to the future we want? Well, let the market decide. Or the government provides huge subsidies for housing. Or we are going to increase transportation. So you collect all of these. And what we have usually been able to do is to refine them into a relatively small set. These are not complete strategies. They're caricatures, they're cartoons. But it allows us to flesh out, okay, what would be the main points of strategy A or strategy B, and then talk about, okay, what are the assumptions and so on and so forth. So we came up with 5 of these strategic concepts. One was called Efficient Monterrey, placing emphasis on administrative reform and so on. One was called Well-Financed Monterrey. What would you do if Infonavit behaved differently, if you had land banks and so on? The third was called Planned Monterrey. What if you could enhance planning in general on a regional basis? The fourth was called Proximate Monterrey. Instead of everybody trying to get into the central business district, you have a number of different centers like that throughout the region. And the fifth one was in many ways the most interesting, called Reconceived Monterrey. And that one was trying to deal with some of the fundamental cultural ideas that exist, such as, the only type of housing worth having is a single family residence so that you can pass it along to the next generation, such as the fact that the municipalities do not see it as their job to deal with the housing issues and so on. So we did that. We discussed that. We then talked about how these might be combined. And again, talking about process outcomes, what we built was a smallish constituency of about 30 people, many of whom representing their organizations, who said this really should go forward. We should do more. So what we're doing now is looking for the funding to broaden this, to deepen it, to engage more people in it on the one hand, and on the other, to support this so far entirely narrative approach to deliberation with something that actually has an analytical foundation?
I'm moving
to it?
right there just right now.
Okay.
It's excellent flow. Because I was thinking that for a long time, the people doing the type of work you've described were in two extremes. One extreme was the workshop facilitator that designed 2 or 3 scenarios for the future based on a few variables.
Right.
And of course, as the capacity to process data that is relevant for the decision evolved and increased, you tended to have the other extreme, which is the person that say, I'm going to sort this out in my computer. I'm going to find the optimal scenario. I can process the data. So you have this concept of deliberation with analysis. And I wanted to give you a chance to talk to us about that process. When in the process you have described enters, you are standing right at the interjection between these two roads. You can do what you just described, but you run a team here with great capacity to run the data that it's relevant for what you just described and inform the teams that are working on this. When does this enter? How do you do this transition? And what is deliberation with analysis?
Well, there are a number of things that you get out of the VSCARP process. And one of them is that it really is kind of a forensic gathering of what needs to be included in any more rigorous quantitative model-based approach. So the VSCARP output is in fact input to the design of how you can develop some kind of an analytical framework that will support deliberations. The U.S. National Academy of Sciences, I think in 1996, when they began to recognize, wicked problems in public policy, particularly climate, kind of developed this concept that what you really want is to integrate deliberation with analytical support in kind of a circular framework, instead of having them operate on parallel tracks, or analysis going in a linear fashion and coming to an end and then just giving results to the policymakers. How can you make this more seamless? And this really addresses a problem that I have long felt exists. Again, working at RAND, the issue of policy was part of everything we did. And I came to, I have appropriated Lord C.P. Snow's term of the two cultures. He wrote about it in both fiction and nonfiction. And you really have a two cultures problem. On the one hand, you have the analytical culture that you and I come from, right? Which is, it's numerate, it's reductive. We're going to kind of cut things down to the smallest level and really figure out, how this system works. And it's systematic. And more than anything else, it is ruled by a deductive logic. We're going to, gather evidence to falsify this hypothesis and accept the other hypothesis. Now you've got the world of policy, which is very different. It's not a numerate culture, it's a narrative culture. It's very detail-oriented, it's nuanced, and it really operates by an inductive logic.
Yeah, and I would say it is action-oriented. We need to do something, and for that, you don't always have the time to analyze or think. So it's less thinking, analysis-oriented.
It has to be. It has to be, because they have problems that they need to solve. And how do they think about policy? They tell stories. They say, what if this happened? What if we did this? What if we did this and they did that? Policy operates according to stories. And so when you have the more traditional approach where you and I do our research and we publish in journals, and then we sort of throw the results into the policy sphere, these are people who get to the office every morning and they're sucking on a fire hose. The last thing they need is for us to dump in more information and give them the job of figuring out what does this mean.
Yep.
So the idea of deliberation with analysis is one that we have grabbed onto and is something that we are trying to do in Monterrey. We have prior experience. We did this, RAND and Tech, in partnership, looking at the problem of water infrastructure in Monterrey. And that work, using this approach, actually became the master plan for the Estado de Nuevo León.
Yeah, and it's been very, very influential in the thinking.
Yeah.
Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today. I've thinking of what I've learned from reading your work, which I would like you to tell people now where they can find it. I think I've learned VSCARP, it's a methodology to rigorously putting a community to think about their future and what they want to achieve in spite of the different perceptions, values, attitudes that they may have towards each other, and that has a methodology that can help in depoliticizing or depolarizing the discussion and promote a more constructive framework. And in times of strong polarization, that's a great contribution that brings together a methodology, or I would say a technology to bring people together to work with the benefits of the large processing capacity of data that we have today. Before we wrap up, would you like to share where our listeners can follow your work, where they can read you? Are you in TikTok?
Unfortunately, I have largely committed myself to the written word. And I understand that's out of fashion. I will say that the work that I did for RAND, one of the things about RAND is the work that we do that does not contain classified information is available for free in its entirety from the RAND website. So one of the things that they could do is look at a recent publication where we applied the same technique to the question of what does the U.S. economy need to be able to provide in the mid-21st century to support domestic needs and national security in an era of geopolitical competition. And that's relatively fresh off the presses. It has the poetic title of Build Thee More Stately Mansions, which is a line from a very, very famous American poem.
Perfect, thank you.
Sure.
To everyone listening, thank you for joining us on the Policy Lab. Stay tuned for our next episode. We'll continue exploring how research and collaboration can illuminate the path toward better public policy and better public decisions.
Thank you very much.